This is St Andrew's, South Brisbane. Please turn to 1 Kings chapter 17 on page 353 of the Church Bibles. Reading from verse 7. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath. I mentioned in the course of last week, I think it was at Tuesday's Equip course, but I think we miss a lot of the inference in the Bible because we're not attuned to so much of the Jewish context and idiom from when it was written. We hear what I've just read and I suspect think, so what? But it was somewhat different when Jesus commented on this passage when addressing the Nazareth synagogue, as recorded in Luke chapter 4. Jesus told them, "I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon." All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove Jesus out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. That was quite a reaction. They obviously felt more strongly about Elijah going to Zarephath than we are wont to. How come? What was the issue? Let's recap. There was a drought-induced famine brought about by God in judgment for Israel's idolatry. The brook at Kerith Ravine dried up, so Elijah had to go somewhere else. That somewhere else, Zarephath, modern-day Sarafand in Lebanon, was about 100 miles or 160 kilometres away, a fair distance in those days. Now, the Lord had promised Elijah food at the end of his journey, but nevertheless, I see it as an act of obedience. But Elijah took the Lord at his word and did as he was told, seemingly unquestioningly. The food was to come from a widow. But widows weren't known for being well-resourced. Usually they were the recipients of charity rather than the dispensers of it. And she was a foreign widow, and that meant pagan. Zarephath was deep in Baal territory. Why would she help Elijah? And yet, he went and sought her out. The reason for the violent reaction by those in the Nazareth synagogue when Jesus spoke about this was religious nationalism. What Elijah had done was undeniable. It was in their scriptures. But they didn't want to be reminded of it in the pointed way Jesus was doing. The NIV Study Bible says, mention of Jesus' reference to God's helping non-Israelites reflects Luke's special concern for the Gentiles. Jesus' point was that when Israel rejected God's message of redemption, God sent him to the Gentiles. And so it will be again if they refuse to accept Jesus. When I visited the Holy Land in 2007, I was aware of thinking, we can't be sure that this is exactly the spot that such and such took place. But we do know that it was within cooee of here, and that Jesus would have looked out at those hills and that lake. And there was one instance when we could say for certain that Jesus stood here, on the steps leading up to the Jerusalem temple. I actually have the same sort of feeling about our passage from 1 Kings. I find it kind of thrilling to think that Jesus read what I'm reading. There are aspects of the passage that I find surprising and significant. I've already mentioned Elijah's willingness to travel into foreign territory on the promise of being provided for by a widow. When he finds her, he's met with, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Verse 12. Elijah, however, is not one to be deterred. He tells her, "First, make a small cake of bread for me from what you have, and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son." Verse 13. Elijah is willing to make this frankly preposterous request on the basis that this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: "The jar of flour will not be used up, and a jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." Verse 14. There's no way that I would have felt able to ask what Elijah does of a widow if I didn't really believe that what God said would come true. But perhaps even more remarkable is the widow's response. She went away and did as Elijah had told her. And then, as Tom Cruise, aka Lieutenant Daniel Caffey, once said, the hits just keep on coming. Verses 17 and 18. Some time later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse, and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Do you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" I think the reference to sin is to do with the fact that the reason any of us die is because of the fall when sin entered the world. And perhaps it's natural for the woman to think, why did Elijah's God preserve us from dying earlier, only to let my son die now and leave me all on my own? Pain is hard to endure, but sometimes it helps us to appreciate what we've got when we emerge on the other side of it. I know that's the case for me whenever I recover from illness. The newfound good health that I'd previously taken for granted seems ever so sweet. The woman had reason to be suspicious of Elijah. He was a foreigner with a different God from her. He came to take the little that she got. Her son died, yet she was willing to go along with him, even trust him and the God whom he served. She gave him bread before preparing anything for herself and her son. She gave him her son in response to his request in verse 19. and each time she was vindicated in so doing. Verse 21 onwards. Elijah cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." This was the first instance in the Bible of someone being raised from the dead, and it marks Elijah apart as the significant figure that he is. You may be tempted to dismiss it as something too far removed from your experienced reality. But bear in mind that not only was it the first such instance, there were only 2 other instances of people being raised from death in the Old Testament, both associated with Elijah's successor, Elisha, as recorded in the 2nd book of Kings. So remarkable was Elijah that 900 years later, people were still on the lookout for an Elijah-like figure. John the Baptist was asked, "Are you Elijah?" John 1:21. No, he wasn't. But then we reach chapter 4, and there's an encounter with a Samaritan woman who is asked, "Will you give me a drink?" What was it Elijah had asked the widow? "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As a result of the encounter with the Samaritan woman, we're told in John 4:42, people said to the woman, "We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Saviour of the world." And before John chapter 4 is out, we have the healing of an official's son who was close to death. Elijah was a great prophet who was still being talked about and looked for 900 years on. He had been described by the widow as a man of God. But now, in John chapter 4, there's someone who really is the Saviour of the world. Jesus said to the woman at the well, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." Amen.